everyone, Megan back from the Wandering Goose again, and we are going to be working on the shamrocks for the birdhouse and the sandwich board. A couple of items you're going to need is your glue, a paint pen if you choose to use them, the colors of paint that came with your kit. For this month, we're working with the 3 shades of green, kudzu, palmetto, and evergreen. You're going to want a sponge, brushes if you have them, a pair of scissors, a cup of water, and also the painter's tape. I find that's easy to put down all of your small pieces. So what you're going to do is you're going to roll the ends and stick it so that it's sticky side up on your table. Right now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sort out all of my pieces that I'm going to do by color. So I have 3 different shades of green, so I'm just going to kind of group together the pieces that I want to be the same color. Makes it a little bit easier when it's painting. You're not wandering around looking for which pieces are going to be which color. Once you have your pieces grouped together, you're going to go ahead and start with your first green. I already had some in my paint palette from a previous project, but the first green I'm using is the lightest color of green. It is the kudzu green, and I'm just going to put a coat of it onto the door piece. If you are doing the sandwich board, your kit won't come with this door. This door is meant for those that do the birdhouse. So just doing a nice even coat of kudzu green on the door. And then I'm going to go ahead and do kudzu green on the rest of my pieces as well. That are all going to be the same kudzu green, and I will use, you can use the brush with that if you like, or I find that the sponge is easier to use for the smaller pieces. As you can see, some of the pieces come off of that backer piece, and then some of the pieces we're going to be painting directly onto the backer. So this particular shamrock we're going to paint directly onto the backer. It's just going to be the one in the middle. The one on top and the one on the bottom are separate pieces. Making sure to put my brush in the water so it doesn't get all crusty. And I'm switching over to the sponge. Perfect for all these little mini shamrocks. You're just going to dab straight up and down with the fattest end of your sponge, getting a nice coverage of the kudzu green on them. Now that we have a nice base coat of the kudzu green on everything, we're going to switch a little bit to the palmetto. I already had a little bit left in my paint tray, and I'm going to put half of my sponge in the palmetto and the other half in the kudzu, and we're just going to blend the sponge into a empty well on my paint palette, just so that it has a nice blended edge, and we're going to just use the palmetto as accent onto our pieces. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure the palmetto on my sponge is facing towards the outside and just dabbing straight up and down, just adding a little bit of shadowing to my piece. If you need to reload your sponge, just make sure that you're putting the correct shade of green into the same side of the sponge that it was originally. Dabbing off onto that empty well again, and just adding a little bit of the palmetto to the edges of my shamrocks. Once I have all of my edges done, I'm going to go ahead and just dip my sponge straight into the palmetto and just getting the whole sponge covered with palmetto. And I'm going to move on to the next pieces of shamrock that I like to paint. So I'm going to do all of the ones with the dark palmetto green on them next. And then here I am going a little bit out of order, and I'm just dipping my sponge into a little bit of the kudzu, and I'm going to go ahead and add some shading to this shamrock. Usually I do all of this at the end when I'm done with each color. Not honestly sure what I was thinking with this day. You're going to see a few things in this video that is just kind of bizarre for what we normally do if you've been following along each month. So just bear with me. While we have a little bit of kudzu and palmetto on our sponge, I decided to go ahead and do some shading onto the door part of our birdhouse. Again, doing that split sponge with the palmetto on the bottom, kudzu up on the top of my sponge, and then sponging it and kind of creating a little bit of an ombre effect on the door piece. You'll see later in this video, I end up not loving that, and I keep going back and forth with this door. It's a lengthy process, so I do apologize, but by the time it's all said and done, it does end up looking cool. Now, if you do like your door the way it is right now, then go ahead and you're done with the door. But if you're not happy with it like I wasn't, I end up going through and kind of demolishing the door and then rebuilding it, so to say. So just bear with me for this video. Here I am not really liking what I'm doing with the door already, so I am going to go ahead and grab my brush that has just a little bit of water on it, and I'm grabbing some of the palmetto green, and I'm trying to just drag it up into the kudzu green to give it more of like a feathered effect. I ended up with too much water on my brush and ended up basically wiping the palmetto off and not blending it like I had hoped, and then creating even a harsher line for my ombre effect. So this technique, I mean, it has its purposes, but it was not for the door for this particular project. So because I'm not liking the way this is turning out, I'm going to add just a little bit of water to my brush, and I am just going to blend the entirety of the door into one color and essentially kind of just start over. Because the palmetto is mixed in there, it ends up being a little bit of a darker green than originally would have been with the kudzu, and I'm setting that off to the side so it can dry, and I can just kind of revisit it later. While I'm waiting for the door to dry, I'm going to go ahead and move on to my other pieces. The green I have in my hand right now is the evergreen, so that is going to be your most true green color. And then as I put it back, I realized I still have more pieces to work on. That is the dark palmetto green. So disregard that I had picked up that green and put it in my hand because I'm not quite ready for it yet. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paint the bottom. So this is going to end up being the bottom piece, the last shamrock on the bottom. And you're going to paint just this part of the shamrock. You're not going to need to paint the shamrock itself on the backer because this piece is going to get glued on top of it. And you can kind of just see where I'm going right over top of those lines where those other shamrocks are going to get glued on top of this one as well. You don't have to go around those lines because, like I said, those other little shamrock pieces are going to get glued on top and cover up any sort of paint that might be there. Once I finish with that shamrock, I'm checking on the status of my door to see how well it's drying. It's taking a little bit too long for my patience, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a paper towel and just wipe the paint off and essentially almost start over. It's going to have a green tint to it because there's really no way to get all that green paint off, but I'm just going to go ahead, wipe it down, make sure it's dry, and we're going to start over on this door. I still want it to be that lighter green, so I'm going to go ahead and refill the well on my paint palette with more of the kudzu. And I'm just going to paint over top of the entirety of the door again, starting back with that base coat of kudzu, and then we're going to go from there. And then while that's drying, I'm just going to pop back over to my original palmetto, waiting for that bottom shamrock to dry. The palmetto can be kind of a streaky color, so sometimes I decide that I want to do a second coat on it. So I'm just going ahead and adding a coat, just a little bit, to the frame of the door piece. Again, this frame piece is going to be for the door, so if you have the sandwich board, this is not a piece you'll have in your kit. Rearranging a couple of the pieces, still using that same dark palmetto green, I'm going to go ahead and do a second coat on the big shamrock. Just getting a nice even coverage on everything so it's not so splotchy looking. When you're ready to switch colors with your sponge, never put it in the water. That's a good way of ruining the sponge. The easiest way of switching colors on a sponge is to take a pair of scissors and cut off the end of your sponge. And then you have a nice clean edge to use for your next color. Now I am finally actually going to move on to the evergreen color. That is that true green. And I'm going to do that with a couple of the remaining pieces. First piece I'm going to use the evergreen on is going to be that top shamrock shape. Just going to do it on the main, the big part of the shamrock, just like we did for the bottom one with the palmetto, but this one's going to be evergreen. Getting a nice even coverage. This is another color that may sometimes be streaky, so you may end up wanting to use a second coat for it. Here I'm going to use just a very minimal amount of paint on my brush with that evergreen color, and I'm just kind of adding a little bit of it to the edges of my door frame to give it a little bit of highlighting. You could also do this with the sponge if you're more comfortable with the sponge. You can just dab a tiny bit of either the evergreen or the kudzu along the outside edge of the door frame. Here I already had it on my brush, so I'm just going to use it with a little bit of my brush. Once I've added the second coat of the evergreen to my shamrocks, I'm good to go ahead and start adding some of the shading to them. So I'm dipping part of my sponge in the kudzu green, which is the lightest green color, and a little bit into the palmetto. And I'm going to go ahead and blend those two colors back in that same spot, and I am going to attempt to work on this silly door again. Starting with the palmetto, half of my sponge being on the bottom. You can see where I'm already starting to look like the first time I did it. But now I'm going to try to use my sponge to kind of pull that palmetto a little bit further up the door. I have palmetto on half of my sponge, kudzu on the other half, and I'm just trying to pull that palmetto a little bit further up. Adding a little bit more palmetto to my sponge and trying to decide how I want to approach this method. So I'm going to add just a little bit of kudzu to it, go back and blend it again. And while I'm at it, I'm going to add the shading. So this is going to be more of a highlighting instead of shadowing onto my dark green palmetto. I decided to add on some of the kudzu as the highlighting. You could always add on evergreen as the highlighting instead. It doesn't have as much of a difference in color as it does with the palmetto and the kudzu, but it's always an option, of course. Then adding a little bit of it to the door frame as well. So I'm going to go back through and grab a little bit of the kudzu and a little bit of the evergreen and do a split sponge for this. Going ahead and blending the sponge into one of my paint palette wells. And now I'm going to use this for my evergreen shamrock pieces just to add a little bit of highlighting to them. Again, you're going to want to make sure that your original color is on the inside and then the new color that you're adding on. So in this case, it's going to be adding kudzu is on the outside edge. And you're just going to dab a little bit of it on the edge, going straight up and down with your sponge. So I added a little bit of the highlighting to my mini shamrocks. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit of the palmetto, which is the dark green, and a little bit of the evergreen, the true green color. Just testing to see if I can do my sponge in that spot, and it's still a little bit wet with the yellow, so I can't. So I'm going to do it right in the middle of my paint palette. Just blending that sponge so you can see top half of it is palmetto and the bottom half was evergreen. Keeping the evergreen to the center of my shamrock and just using the palmetto for the outside edge. As you can see there, there's not as much of a difference as there was with the kudzu. So I'm adding a little bit more of the palmetto, trying to get it a little bit darker. And still not as much of a difference, but if you're looking for something a little bit more subtle, then this might be the route you want to go. Adding a little bit of the palmetto to each of the edges of my shamrock, just adding some shadowing. So now I'm going back to the Door of Doom. I now have evergreen and palmetto on my sponge. So I'm going to take the palmetto and run it along where the palmetto already was. And I'm going to use the evergreen as sort of a bridge between the palmetto and the kudzu. Using my brush there is just a little bit to kind of blend it. And adding a little bit more of the palmetto and the evergreen to my sponge. And I'm just trying to get a little bit of extra color into my door so it's not quite so two-dimensional. So I've got palmetto at the top of the sponge right now, evergreen on the bottom, and then the kudzu is still the base color. So now I'm adding some kudzu and evergreen to my sponge, finding an empty spot to blend out the colors. And once they're blended, I'm going to have the evergreen be at the top. So it's in the evergreen section. And then the kudzu at the bottom to blend into that existing kudzu that was already on the back of the door. Looking a little bit better. Just working on blending those colors. Next, I'm going to grab a small brush and dip it in just a tiny bit of water. And dip it into a little bit of the white paint. And I'm going to use it to add some speckling to my pieces. The last thing you want to do is the speckling. The speckling is the last part of doing all of this. You're going to want to make sure you do all of your shading and highlighting first with all your different colors. And then when you're done with that, you're going to go ahead and just take your brush, keep your finger steady, and do a downward flick off of your finger onto your pieces. It's a little bit hard to see in this video. I should have zoomed in a little bit. But what essentially is doing is just leaving behind little tiny pinpricks of white paint onto my pieces, just to give them a little bit of interest, I'd say. So I'm just dabbing my brush into the water, grabbing a little bit of white paint, swirling it around so I get a nice coverage on my brush. And as you can see, I am flicking it off of my finger. That's why my finger is turning white, straight down onto my pieces. You can do this as much or as little as you want. The more water you add to your paint, the more subtle the color is going to be for it. If you want it to be more of a brighter white, then add less water to your brush. If you don't add water to your brush, though, you could end up with big globs of paint or splatters where essentially it globs and then trails. So I find it's a little bit easier to do it if you add a little bit of water to your paintbrush before you start speckling. So next I'm going to take my extra fine white paint marker. We use the Posca paint brand here. And I'm just going to add some accent lines to my pieces. Where you add accent lines is 100% up to you. You can add as many or as few of them as you'd like, or you can completely skip this part altogether. As you can see off to the right, I had already added accent lines to that piece, so you can kind of get an idea of what the look is going to be if you decide to add the accent lines. Once your accent lines are added where you want them to be, the next step is going to be to glue. I prefer to use the Gorilla Super Glue for our purposes. It just sets very quickly, which you do need to remember. It sets very quickly, so you don't have a whole lot of work time with it. And it only takes a few seconds for it to adhere. If you don't have the Gorilla Super Glue, you can absolutely just use any wood glue that you have. Just remember that wood glue does take a little bit longer for it to set. So if you have any pieces that might shift while it's gluing, you just want to keep an extra eye on them to make sure that there's no shifting. So here I'm just gluing together the pieces of the door. If you have the sandwich board, you can skip this part. Just adding all my pieces on, holding down for a second or so. And I just let gravity do the rest. Most of the time, I don't actually have to physically hold my pieces together with the super glue. I will just glue them together, set it off to the side, and then by the time I'm done doing all of my pieces, that piece is usually dry and ready to be used. Just adding a little bit of glue to glue these little mini shamrocks on top of the big shamrocks, and then you're going to glue the big shamrock onto the backer piece. Just making sure you dry fit all of your pieces together first, and make sure you have paint in all of the places where you need to have paint, and make sure there is no naked wood showing, because it's a little bit difficult to go back and repaint again once everything is glued together. And then you just want to make sure all of your edges are lining up perfectly so that you don't have any of the naked wood showing. Once you finish gluing all of your pieces and everything is adhered, you can go ahead and add the Velcro to the back side of the tall piece and attach it to either your sandwich board or your birdhouse. Thanks so much for joining me for another month of the subscription box, and I can't wait to show you what next month is. Thanks.